Okay. Here we go. So today we're going to cover Winbind. Basically, the way this works, you just trying to integrate Linux systems into Active Directory. So you'll add some stuff. You'll install some packages onto a Linux system so that you can join to the domain, and then you can authenticate using Kerberos, grab users over LDAP, things like that. Generally speaking, we want to use this in more like long-form competitions. So if you're doing like ANL or Ice Age, where you have 3 weeks to set up, it's probably more beneficial for you to actually just centralize all of your authentication in one place. So you have all your users in one place. You only have to change your passwords once if they get compromised. Generally speaking, having that single point of failure on the domain controller isn't going to be as big of an issue because you've had all that time to set up and secure it. So, but in like a real world, in like a CCDC competition, you don't really want to do this because putting in that single point of failure could really screw you over if you lose a domain controller, which happens. Yeah. So let's get started. Jump on the Debian machine. So in this directory, you'll see auth.sh. You just have to run that so you can authenticate against the captive portal. And then you should get user authenticated if you did it right. And we'll just run apt update. And we're good to go. So first we're going to install Samba and Winbind. So these are basically the two packages that we'll install that will allow us to join the domain and then grab user information off the domain. We won't actually use it for authentication because LDAP authentication is not particularly secure and it tends to get a little bit broken depending on the piece of software you're using. For example, on Dovecot, just like doing a bind authentication against a domain controller doesn't really work in Dovecot just because the software just doesn't do it very well. So we're going to try to use Kerberos instead. But first, we'll apt install Samba Winbind libpam Winbind. That libpam Winbind will allow us to use Winbind for authentication. And then libnss Winbind. And libnss, that's a name server switch library, which will allow us to integrate our Winbind users into our passwords. Basically it'll add those users onto our etc password. So when we try to like enumerate the users on our system, we'll see all those users and we can authenticate with like normal, like all our regular services without having to do any additional configuration. There we go. Alright, once that's done, we'll edit the etc samba smb.conf. We'll add our configuration to integrate into the domain. So we want to do all of this under the global tag. If you try to add it down at the bottom, it'll be under the wrong section and it won't work. So make sure you do it all under this global tag. So I'm going to change work group to goats, which is the name of our domain. We're going to set security to ADS, which means we're using an Active Directory system for our security. and then we'll set our realm to goats.lan. And make sure you do all this in uppercase. Samba can get a little bit picky about making sure everything is in uppercase. Okay, so now I'm going to jump down to ID map. Just down here, just so I don't have to type all this out. And then we're going to set ID map UID from 10,000 to 20,000. Basically what this tells the system is that when I grab all these users from Active Directory, I need to give them a user ID, right? I need to give them a group ID. By default, it's not going to know where to put them, so we just map them onto this range. Usually put it in a high range. You want to make sure that this doesn't overlap with your actual like system users, because if it does, you'll get some weird stuff where like one Active Directory user has like exactly the same as like a user on your local system. So like it won't be able to differentiate between the two. You'll see that sometimes when like red team will add a user to your Etsy password with UID 0, and then they can act as root even though they're not root. Then we're going to set template shell to bin bash. This is something you don't necessarily have to do. You can set it to bin false, or actually probably more likely to bin false or bin true, depending on your setup. Basically what template shell does, it sets in Etsy password what shell they have. Depending on your situation, you might not want to give them a shell. Say you're using Active Directory to like authenticate users for like Dovecot or some other service, like a mail service or like FTP or something like that. They don't necessarily need to have a shell, so you don't really want to give them a shell if you don't have to. In that case, you can put bin false or bin true, depending on how your service does authentication. So for Dovecot, it's not actually going to check that they can log in using their shell, so you can just set it to bin false and that's fine. For other things, it might check that it actually has a valid shell, in which case bin true is probably your better bet. There's some like edge case situations where if you set like their shell to bin true, they will be able to authenticate using SSH, but then they'll just get their connection dropped right away, which is kind of funny. Depending on if the white team scoring engine is particularly bad. If they're just checking that they can authenticate, sometimes you can just set their shells to bin true and then it's just fine and red team can't do anything. But generally speaking, your scoring engine should actually check. Oops. Once it logs in, try to run a command or something like that. Okay, so after that, we're going to do template homedir. We're set it to home %d and then %u. So that's basically saying we're going to throw all these Active Directory users into a subdirectory in home. That's going to be the name of the domain, and then we'll put them in a folder with their username. After that, we'll do winbind enum users equals yes. Do the same for groups. Basically, what this tells Winbind to do is that when you run getEnt or getEnt password or getEnt group, it'll actually show those Active Directory users. By default, that's set to no because in certain, like if you have like a ton of Active Directory users and you tried to use getEnt, it would take quite a bit of time to actually pull all that stuff off the domain controller and show it to you. So they try to leave that off for performance reasons, but we want to keep it on so we can actually test stuff. Then we'll do winbind use default domain equals yes. And restrict anonymous equals 2. The restrict anonymous basically says to Winbind, don't allow people to query like users and groups off the system anonymously. They actually have to like authenticate against us before they can get that information. So that's it for Samba config. So we can service SMBD restart and service winbind restart. So now we are all set there on the Samba side, so that'll give us basically our be able to enumerate our users and groups off of Active Directory, but we still need a way to authenticate securely without using LDAP. So to do that, we're going to apt install. Actually, did anything break for you? Or are you good?
Good.
Cool. krb5-user and libpam krb5. So this is going to let us use Kerberos to authenticate against the domain controller. So as like a rough overview of how Kerberos works, basically you will query the domain controller with your username, and then the domain controller will like look up your username in its database, and then it will figure out if you actually exist. If you do, it'll pull your password hash out, and it will encrypt basically a random piece of data with your username and with your password hash. It'll send it back to you, and then on your side, you will take your password hash, you'll hash it in the same way that it's been done on the domain controller, and you'll decrypt that data, and in there will be a session key that you use to encrypt your communications going back and forth. So in that decryption on the client side, you have the implicit authentication of your username and password. So for our default Kerberos realm, we're going to set goats.lan. And the Kerberos servers are going to be dc.goats.lan. And then our admin server is dc.goats.lan. And since it asked all of this stuff in the installation process, we don't necessarily have to do this, but if we want to look in etckrb5.conf, we'll see all these settings that we put in there. So we'll see the default realm is goats.lan. If we scroll all the way down, we see these settings. Let me back up. For some reason, I don't know why, but it throws like a bunch of like default like university Kerberos servers in there for some reason. I don't know why it does that. But yeah, so we have our KDC goats.lan, DC goats.lan. So the admin server and the KDC will basically tells us where to go to get certain types of tickets from our Kerberos, through Kerberos, in order to authenticate. So at this point, we need to change our DNS settings. So if we go to Etsy Network Interfaces, we change our name servers. So basically, Active Directory relies heavily on DNS in order to basically do everything in Active Directory. So in order to actually join the domain and query things off the domain controller and things like that, we actually have to use the domain controller for our DNS server. So we'll set that to 192.168.1.2, which is the IP of our domain controller. And just so I don't have to do if down, if up, I'll just edit it in resolve.conf as well. Oops. Okay. So if you want to just double check, we can run nslookup dc.goats.lan. We should get the IP of the domain controller. So at this point, we're going to check that our Kerberos settings are correct. So we'll run kinit. I should probably make that bigger slightly. So we'll run kinit administrator at goats.lan. Once again, make sure you have all this and make sure you have goats.lan in all caps. It'll ask you for your password. Password one bang. And if you get no output, that means it worked. If it errored out, it'll tell you that. So that means that our settings are correct. Basically what we just did there was we tried to grab a ticket from the domain controller, and it worked for us. So now we're going to actually join the domain. So we'll do net ads join -U administrator, and then if you just hit enter here, it'll ask you for your password. If you want to, you can supply it on the command line, though obviously make sure you clear your history afterwards. So you can do it like that. You do a % and then password. If all goes well, it'll complain that it can't configure DNS for the system you just added, which is fine. that means you successfully added yourself to the domain. We don't really care about the DNS part. So at this point, if you restart Winbind and Samba,
can we edit the NS switch booth?
we can, but this will work too. I just want to show off that we're actually connected. So if you do that and then you type wb-info-u, it'll list all the users on the domain controller. You should be able to do -g as well for all the groups. So at this point, we're connected to the domain. We can get all the information for the users. We can authenticate as these users. The only problem is that the system doesn't know that we want to use the system in order to like get our user accounts and authenticate. So the way we do that is we edit the etc NS switch conf. Scroll up here. And then by group, we'll put Winbind, and by password, we'll put Winbind. And basically that tells the system to query Winbind for users and groups. So if we do get int password now, you should see over here we have all our user accounts from the domain controller. You'll notice that instead of an X in that second portion, which is where password hashes used to be, on the domain controller accounts we'll have a star instead. Basically that's telling us that these user accounts aren't on the system, they're somewhere else, and they're being authenticated somewhere else. So they aren't going to be in Etsy shadow, basically. So we can do get int group as well. And we'll see all those groups from the domain controller there. And so you can use these groups like you would normally on a Linux system. So you can, like, if you want to put in your SSH config, I want to only allow users from this group to be able to log in over SSH. You can do that using these domain groups. The only tricky part is the spaces can sort of screw things up a little bit. I believe we managed to get around that using, I think quotes worked in the SSH config. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah. So the only problem we have right now, so we can sue as like a random user. We can go to Bob, password run bang. The only problem is he doesn't have home directory because that doesn't get created by default. So here's a quick script to do that. So do for user in wb-info-u. We'll do make home dir underscore helper, the username, and then done. Oops, mistyped it. There we go. And if we ls/home/goats, we'll see we have all those home directories there now. So we can sudo Alice, she can go back to her home directory, and it all works fine. So at this point, we have a working Winbind setup. The main issue right now is actually getting the firewall in place so that you're not wide open. I have not done extensive testing on this, but from what I can tell, from what little I've done, is that you can just do. That doesn't make sense. Oh, I'm not root. So, basically Winbind uses like a ton of ports on the domain controller to connect back over. So it does like LDAP, it does NetBIOS, it does the SMB port 445, it does Kerberos on port 88, and then there are some dynamic ports, high ports, which screw everything up. So the simplest thing you can do is just do IP tables -a output. Luckily, you don't need anything inbound, but on outbound, do output -d 192.168.1.2. So just allow all traffic to your domain controller. That's the simplest way to do it. You won't see a ton of issues with that. other than maybe like a red teamer could like pivot off your system into the domain controller using this method. Another option would be to actually find the range of the dynamic ports on the domain controller, and then you can restrict down to basically LDAP, NetBIOS, SMB, and then Kerberos, plus those dynamic ports. I'd say the only issue with doing it the simple way would be that you end up leaving open things that are on like low ports, like RDP, and if you have SSH on a Windows system or something stupid like that. Yeah. So that is it for the Debian side. CentOS works basically the same way, except you install some different packages. Package names are different. Other than that, it's basically the same. If you want to do that on your own. The nice thing about CentOS is that if you scroll down here, it has basically command auth config, which will you can use it to actually edit these config files like the etc samba smb.conf and the krb5.conf and things like that. It'll do that for you using the command line. It's a little bit unwieldy because you end up with these long strings with a bunch of like double dash options. But the nice thing it does have is the enable make home dir, which will create a user's home directory once they the first time they log in, and so you don't have to do that manually. So yeah, this was a pretty quick session. Do you have any questions? No. Okay. So that's about it here. Next week we'll probably do Palo stuff. So we get into like the network firewall things, and then I want to get into ESXi the week after, hopefully. So we can get some more advanced, more like infrastructure type things, which would be cool. Right.